Okay. Hello, everyone. 29 December, weekly Marx. It's a Sunday, almost the new year. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Soviet Stern's on Twitter. Um, he's done a complete a map of how you should read all three volumes of Capital. It's quite a task, and now that he's got it slightly well animated, I suppose, it's actually quite amusing. Anyway, we're looking at the Princeton 2024 September version of Marx Chapter 1, Volume 1, and the Two Pauls version. We're finally on to Chapter 2 after plodding through the footnotes or the endnotes and the the editor's notes of Volume 1. So we're finally starting Chapter 2. And I put in a just a little segment of the previous translation of uh, Volume 1, Chapter 2, that's available on Marxist.org just for comparison. And you can see that there is quite a difference, actually. And I think it'll be explained in the editor's notes. Chapter 2 is the exchange process. You'll note that yesterday I introduced the idea of some ancillary ideas, that is the idea of money bins, because I like using that as an example since it sort of sits in people's consciousness. Um, and it's sort of perfect in the sense that it comes up during, World War II, et cetera. Karl Barks thinking about Scrooge and thrift and um, Scrooge McDuck, that is. And it's sort of interesting. And I think those ideas still intersect. You could say that those exact same issues exist today in a variety of ways worth talking about in some other contexts. The exchange process. No commodity makes it to the market or is exchanged for other commodities without help. We need then to consider the keepers of commodities, commodity owners. Commodities are things and thus defenseless against people. If they're unwilling to belong to someone, that person can use force. In other words, simply take them. Commodity owners can put things into a relation as commodities only when they treat one another as people whose wills reside in those things, and an owner who doesn't acquire another's commodity unless both parties are willing. Each person disposing of his own commodity acquires someone else's only through an act of will common to both people. So each person must acknowledge the other as a private owner. This juridical relation has the form of a contract, whether worked out in accordance with the legal system or not. It is a relation of wills that reflects an economic relation. The economic relation determines the content of the juridical relation or the relation of wills. Here, people exist for one another merely as representatives of commodities, hence as commodity owners. Their economic actors, masks, are, as we will see, merely personifications of economic relations. They interact as the bearers of those relations. What distinguishes a commodity owner from a commodity is mainly that for the latter, the physical body of every other commodity means something only as the form of appearance of its own value. Remember, we talked about appearance yesterday. Born as levelers and cynics, commodities would pounce on the opportunity to trade not only their souls, but also their bodies with any other commodity, even one more off-putting than Marie Tourne's herself. The commodity lacks a feel for what is concrete in the physical bodies of commodities, but no matter, its owner makes up for that with his five basic senses and others too. His own commodity has no direct use value for him, otherwise, he wouldn't bring it to the market. His commodity has use value for others. For a commodity's owner, a commodity has direct use value only as a bearer of exchange value. and thus as a means of exchange. That is why he wants to dispose of it in exchange for a commodity whose use value satisfies one of his wants or needs. All commodities are non-use values for their owners, use values for their non-owners. Thus, all commodities must change hands. When they change hands in this way, they are exchanged, and exchange brings them into a relation with one another as values and realizes them as values. Commodities must therefore be realized as values before they can be realized as use values. Commodities must prove themselves as use values, however, before they can be realized as values. How so? The human labor expended to produce them counts only insofar as it's expended in a form useful to others, and only exchange establishes whether it's in fact useful to others, whether what it has produced satisfies another's want or need. Every owner wants to dispose of his own commodity only in exchange for a commodity whose use value satisfies one of his wants or needs. Here, exchange is a purely individual process for him. But the owner also wants to realize his commodity as a value. He wants to realize it in some other commodity of the same value, regardless of whether or not his own commodity has use value for the other owners. Here, exchange is a general and social process for the owner. The same process can't be both purely individual and purely general and social, however, for all commodity owners. When we take a closer look, we see that every commodity owner treats every commodity that isn't his as the particular equivalent of his own commodity, while trading his own commodity as the general equivalent of all the other commodities. Because all commodity owners do this, no single commodity is the sole general equivalent. And thus, commodities don't have a general relative value form either, a form in which they are equated as values and compared as magnitudes of value. Commodities don't face one another as commodities then, but solely as products or use values. As our commodity owners deal with this predicament, they think like Faust. In the beginning was the deed. They act before they think. The laws of a commodity's nature operate in the natural instincts of its owner. Commodity owners can put their commodities into relation with one another as values, and thus as commodities, only by putting their commodities into an antithetical and complementary relation with a commodity that functions as the general equivalent. Our analysis of the commodity showed that this is so. But only social action can make one particular commodity into the general equivalent. The social action of every other commodity sets one commodity apart, the one through which all the others represent their value, which is how the natural form of that one commodity gets its role as the socially valid equivalent form. As a result of this social process, the specific social function of the commodity that has been set apart is to be the general equivalent. That commodity thus turns into ... money. And we don't speak Latin anymore, but, I can reel through this. Illi unum consilium habent et virtutum et potestatem suum bestiae tradunt et quis posset emere aut vendere nisi qui habet certum aut nomen bestiae aut numerarum nominis eius, from Revelation. I'll give you a second here, and you don't have, this is not in Latin, but this is the first part of the earlier version of Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 2, Exchange. And you can sort of read this for yourself. I'll let you read this for a second, just to get a sense of how slightly different this is from New Trans. So it's pretty similar, and I won't read it because you'll just get more confused by my terrible translations. My terrible reading. We're back to the 2024 version. The money crystal takes shape as a necessary product of the exchange process, in which diverse labor products are in fact equated with one another and thus actually transformed into commodities. Exchange widens and deepens over time, thereby developing the opposition between use value and value slumbering in the commodity's nature. Commerce requires that this opposition be represented externally, which brings about a drive to create an independent expression of commodity value. And this need isn't definitely or definitively satisfied, nor does it even let up until a commodity is doubled, becoming a commodity and money at the same time. At the same time at which labor products are transformed into commodities, one commodity is transformed into money. Remember, we were looking at those the chart of how the structure of the argument of book one and how it moves from the commodity to concrete versus abstract use value, et cetera, and ultimately moves to commodity form of one kind and then into money. And there is a logical path for this, and it can actually be diagrammed. I know this sounds a little more complicated because we're sort of going in the weeds here, but when you see how Marx does have an idea here, and it's structured in a certain way, and book one does have that kind of front loading, as I've said before, of certain kinds of concepts, of course, affected ultimately by further editing by Engels, etc. The direct exchange of products already has, in one respect, the form of a simple value expression, but in another respect, it doesn't yet have it. That form is X commodity A equals Y commodity B. That is, X amount of commodity A equals Y amount of commodity B. The form of the direct exchange of products is X use object A equals Y use object B. Things A and B aren't commodities before they are exchanged. Only through exchange do they become commodities. The first way it is possible to use a use object to be an exchange value is for the object to exist as a non-use value, as a quantity of use value that goes beyond the immediate wants or needs of its owner. Things in and for themselves are external to human beings, who can therefore dispose of them. In order to reciprocally dispose of these things that can be disposed of, all people need to do is tacitly agree to interact as the thing's private owners, that is, as people who are independent of one another. Relationships characterized by this kind of reciprocal foreignness don't exist for the members of a spontaneously arising community, whether it has the form of a patriarchal family, an ancient Indian commune, the Incan state, or something else. You can see where this is going and its relation to primitive accumulation. Commodity exchange begins where such communities end, at points of contact with foreign communities or their members. But as soon as things become commodities for the outside world, they turn into commodities inside a community as well, due to a rebound effect. At first, chance alone determines the quantitative ratios at which commodities are exchanged. Commodities begin to be exchanged because of an act of will. Their owners agree to dispose of them reciprocally. In the meantime, it's describing the market, right? In the meantime, people gradually come to rely on use objects produced by others. Constant repetition makes exchange into a normal social process. And so in time, at least some labor products must be created with exchange as their purpose. And there is a hardening of the distinction between the usefulness things have for meeting immediate wants and needs and for the usefulness for exchange. From that moment on, the use value of things splits off from their exchange value, while the ratios at which things are exchanged now start to depend on how they are produced. Custom fixes things at specific magnitudes of value. In the direct exchange of products, every commodity is for its owner a direct means of exchange, and for its non-owners an equivalent, although only insofar as it has use value for them. Thus, the exchange article doesn't yet have a value form independent of its use value or of the individual wants and needs of those engaged in exchange. The need for such a form arose only as the commodities entering the exchange process grew in number and kind. As this need emerged, so did the means for meeting it. When there are commercial transactions in which commodity owners exchange their own goods for assorted other goods and compare their goods with other goods, assorted owners, assorted commodities are always exchanged for and compared with values with one and the same third type of commodity. In becoming the equivalent for assorted other commodities, this third commodity attains directly, but within narrow limits, the general or social equivalent form. This general equivalent form comes and goes with the momentary social encounters that bring it into being. Fleetingly, it attaches now to one commodity, now to another. But as commodity exchange develops, the general equivalent form becomes firmly attached only to certain kinds of commodities, and thus it crystallizes into the money form. At first, chance alone determines which type of commodity the money form attaches itself to. Nevertheless, generally speaking, two circumstances play a decisive role. The money form becomes attached either to the most important exchange articles from outside the community, which are in fact the spontaneously arising forms of appearances of local products' exchange value, or else to the main use object constituting the part of the community's property that can be disposed of. Cattle, for example. Nomadic peoples were the first to develop the money form because all their possessions were in a portable form and could thus be directly disposed of, and also because their way of life constantly brought them into contact with foreign communities, thereby inviting exchange with the outside world. Human beings often made other beings in the form of slaves into the original money material, but they couldn't have imagined doing that with land, except in Woody Allen films. Such a thought could occur only in advanced bourgeois society. The idea dates to the last third of the 17th century, and people first attempted to act on it on a national scale only a century later during France's bourgeois revolution. The exchange of commodities bursts its merely local bonds, and commodity value thereby spreads to the point where it becomes the materialization of human labor as such. In the same proportion, the money form is transferred to commodities whose nature makes them well suited to fulfill the social functions of a general equivalent. Precious metals. Let me break there for a second to remind you that there is, gold is still being mined and it is being accumulated. Recent article on the RAND Corporation, the RAND think tank, has commented on Russian gold in that context. Back to the text, sorry. Although gold and silver are not by nature money, money is by nature gold and silver because the natural properties of gold and silver align with money's functions. Up to now, however, we have discussed only one of its functions to serve as commodity value's form of appearance, as the material through which commodities' magnitudes of value find social expression. A material has to have the same uniform quality in every instance in order to be an adequate form of appearance for value, i.e., to be the materialization of abstract and therefore equal human labor. On the other hand, the money commodity must be capable of expressing purely quantitative differences, because the differences among magnitudes of value are purely quantitative. Thus, it needs to be something people can divide and recombine as they please. Gold and silver have these properties by nature. The use value of the money commodity undergoes a doubling. Gold, for example, has a particular use value as a commodity. It can fill hollow teeth, serve as the raw material for luxury goods, and so on. It also gains a formal use value stemming from its specific social function. Since all the other commodities are simply money's particular equivalents, with money being their general equivalent, they all interact with money as particular commodities interacting with the general commodity. Readers have seen that the precondition for the money form is that a single commodity must become decisively established as the one in which relations among all other commodities are reflected. The fact that money is a commodity is news only to those who start with its finished form and begin to analyze it there. The exchange process gives the commodity it transforms into money not its value, but its specific value form. Confusing these two characteristics has misled people into thinking that the value of gold and silver is imaginary. Because money can be replaced by mere symbols for some functions, another error sprung up. The notion that money itself is merely a symbol. Then again, this error did suggest the idea that a thing's money form is external to the thing itself, merely the form of appearance of the human relations hidden beneath it. In this sense, every commodity is a symbol because, as value, it's only the thingly husk of the human labor expended to produce it. But in framing it as mere symbols, the social characteristics that things acquire, or the thingly characteristics that labor's social determinations acquire based on a particular mode of production, people have also framed these characteristics as an arbitrary product of human reflection. Now, this is how people generally tried to enlighten themselves about the money form in the 18th century. They used this explanation to make enigmatic forms of human relations no longer seem strange, at least provisionally, at a time when they couldn't identify the genesis of these forms, of those forms. We noted above that a commodity's equivalent form doesn't imply the quantitative determination of its magnitude of value. Knowing that gold is money and therefore directly exchangeable with every other commodity doesn't mean we know, for example, how much 10 pounds of gold is worth. Like all commodities, money has to express its magnitude of value relatively through other commodities. Its own value is determined by the labor time needed to produce it. Its value is expressed through the quantity of every other commodity that contains the same amount of coagulated labor time. Money's relative magnitude of value is established by direct exchange, where money is produced. The moment that gold begins to circulate as money, its value is already given. Even in early analyses of money in the last decades of the 17th century, analyses that have been thoroughly improved upon, political economists understood that money is a commodity. Ultimately, however, that was just an initial step. What is difficult isn't recognizing that money is a commodity. It is figuring out how and why it got to be one. As we've seen, in this, even in the simplest expression of value, that is X commodity A, X time of commodity A, or Y of commodity B, the thing through which another thing's magnitude of value is represented seems to have the equivalent form independently of this relation, or as a socio-natural property. We've been tracking how this false semblance becomes entrenched. The process is complete the moment the general equivalent form intertwines with the natural form of a particular commodity. In other words, crystallizes into the money form. A commodity doesn't seem to turn into money because all the other commodities represent their value through that commodity. It is the other way around. Commodities all seem to represent their value through that commodity because it is money. The movement mediating this process is so thoroughly obscured by its own result that no trace is left. This is probably the key point and signifies, a lot of this kind of process of exchange. Commodities find their own value shape as something ready-made, the physical body of a commodity that exists outside and also alongside them. Emerging from the earth's bowels, these things, gold and silver, incarnate at one end directly all human labor. Hence the magic of money. Human beings now behave in a purely atomistic way in their social production process, and in their own relations of production have a thingly form independent of their control and conscious individual action. These circumstances, the former and also the latter, and thus also the latter, first appear through the fact that labor products generally take on the commodity form. The enigma of the money fetish, then, is merely the enigma of the commodity fetish, now in a form in which we can see it well enough to be blinded by it. So, the end of chapter 2. If you want more contemporary examples that sort of reflect on the kinds of human conflict that involve, there's, let's see, it's a Finnish film called Sisu, which I find quite amusing. It even has its own humor despite its brutality. And we can think of popular examples like the flea market, or at least in this part of the country, the tag sale. Um, Certain things at which we begin to see how the commodities sort of work through. In a tag sale, the prices are declared. Doesn't mean that you can't haggle over them, but at least it sets an index for discussion, I suppose, rather than just putting the darn things out there, which happens often as well. But I think you need to, when you see how a negotiation occurs, and it is human, right? Although some of us don't like to haggle, so therefore, better to be just sort of not worry about the opportunity costs and sort of accept it more or less as it is, and seek bargains elsewhere in other forms. All right, the end notes. Number one, in the 12th century, so famous for its piety, a person could often find very very delicate things among these commodities. Thus, a French poet of that time listed femmes folles de leur cour among the commodities on display at the landed fair, alongside clothes, shoes, leather, farming equipment, hides, and so on. Number two, in the endnotes. First, Proudhon derived his ideal of justice, justice éternelle, from the legal relations that go with commodity production, whereby he showed that commodity production is as eternal as justice, and thus gave the petty bourgeois a source of comfort. Then he turned around and tried to revise actual commodity production and the actual legal system that corresponds to it in accordance with this ideal. Now, how would one feel about a chemist who, rather than studying actual metabolic laws and then drawing on those laws to solve particular problems, wanted to revise metabolic processes using the eternal ideas of naturalité and affinité? That's so very French. When we say that usury contradicts justice éternelle and équité éternelle and mutualité éternelle and other vérités éternelles, do we not know more about it than the church fathers did when they said that it contradicts grace éternelle, éternelle, foi éternelle, and la volonté éternelle de Dieu? You can see he's making a joke here about, the things that are Caesar's and things that are God's. Every piece of property has two uses. Note number three, one is proper to the thing and the other is not. Take the wearing of a shoe, for example, and its use in exchange. Both are uses to which shoes can be put. For someone who exchanges a shoe for money or food with someone else who needs a shoe, is using the shoe as a shoe. But this is not its proper use, because it does not come to exist for the sake of exchange. Well, in fact, it does. If you've ever been in a store that allows you to try on both pairs of shoes in a discount rack, and often you come across shoes that have been left there by people who take the shoe for sale, put it on, and then walk out the door, leaving behind their former shoes that they walked in with. That is always interesting to me. Number four, from this one can gain a sense of the craftiness of the petty bourgeois socialism that is out to perpetuate commodity production and at the same time abolish the antagonism between money and commodities. That is, abolish money, since money only exists in and through that antagonism. Take a note for Star Trek in that sense. One might just as well get rid of the Pope while letting Catholicism continue to exist. For a more detailed discussion of this point, see my Zur Kritik du Pol, Critic of Political Economy, the contribution that is that is found in the MECW, which is the Marx Engels Collected Works, Volume 29. That reference, of course, is updated with the advent of the MEGA. Anyway. Note 5. As long as two distinct use objects aren't exchanged for each other, but rather a chaotic mass of things is offered for the equivalent of a third thing, a common practice among savages. We haven't yet advanced to the direct exchange of objects. We're only in its foyer. Number 6. This is the English translation version. It is only natural that metals are money. And a further explanation of that. Number 7, for a detailed account of this, see the chapter on the precious metals and the work of mine just cited. That is English translation 385 to 88. Note 8, money is the universal commodity. Number 9, silver and gold themselves, which we may call by the general name of bullion, are commodities rising and falling in value. Bullion may be reckoned to be of higher value, where the smaller weight will purchase the greater quantity of the product or manufacture of the country, etc. Is a citation for the 1695 text. Further on, silver and gold, coined or uncoined, though they are used for a measure of all things, are no less a commodity than wine, oil, tobacco, cloth, or stuffs. Similarly, another East Indies discourse from 1689 and 1677 on the East India trade, the stock and riches of the kingdom cannot properly be confined to money, nor ought gold and silver to be excluded from being merchandise. So, Marx is looking at this whole question of how things are exchanged, particularly in reference to gold, noting, of course, that Marx only later goes to the financialization issue, where you can create things that are not necessarily the equivalent of gold, and which is a continuing issue for many people, as I mentioned with that Russian thing. Note number 10, gold and silver had value as metals before becoming money. And then he makes a reference to a translation of De la Moneta by Ferdinando Galliani. Locke says, the universal consent of mankind gave to silver, on account of its qualities, which made it suitable for money, an imaginary value. Jean Law, on the other hand, asks how different nations could give how different nations could give an imaginary value to a thing, or how this imaginary value could have been maintained. But he himself comprehended almost nothing of this, stating, for example, money was exchanged on the basis of its value for uses, and it was given as money in exchanges based on its value. It received an additional value, une valeur additionnelle, equal to the increase in demand caused by its use as money. And this is a reference to 18th century money. Note 11, money in goods is the sign. As a sign, it is attracted by goods. Money is a sign of a thing and represents it. From Montesquieu, 1767. Money is not a mere sign, for it is itself wealth. It does not represent values. It is their equivalent. If one considers the concept of value, the thing itself is regarded merely as a sign and accounts not as itself, but what as it is worth. And this gets into what Hegel sort of comments. Long before the political economists, lawyers made it fashionable to think of money as a mere symbol, and of the value of precious metals as purely imaginary. Here they were serving royal power obsequiously. Throughout the Middle Ages, they supported their power's right to debase the coinage, doing so by invoking the traditions of the Roman Empire and the conception of the money that obtained in the digest. The editor's note here is, the digest was a main component of Roman civil law. It was a compendium of excerpts from legal writings. Let there be no doubt, says their apt pupil, Philip Valois, in a decree of 1346, that to only us and our royal majesty belongs the trade, the state, the provision of and all ordinances on currency, and the power to fix such a rate and such a price as pleases us and as we see fit. The editor's note here is that Philip of Valois, Philip VI of France, waged many wars against England, and this necessitated various creative revenue-generating measures on his part. It was a maxim of Roman law that the value of money was fixed by imperial decree. Treating money as a commodity was explicitly prohibited. And then there's the Latin, and I won't burden you with the pecunius vero nulli imere, etc. This Latin sentence, the editors translate it as, in truth, no one should be permitted to buy money, because it is right that money, which was established for public use, is not a reward. How different that is now. G.F. Pagnini offers a useful discussion of this in a text on by Pagnini polemicizing against the legal gentleman, especially in the second part of his work. Note number 12, if a man can bring to London an ounce of silver out of the earth in Peru in the same time that he can produce a bushel of corn, then one is the natural price of the other. Now, if by reason of new and more easier mines, like in England, a man can produce 2 ounces of silver as easily as he formerly did 1, the corn will be as cheap at 10 shillings the bushel as it was before at 5 shillings, ceteris paribus. So this is reasonable, of course, in the sense of arguing that Marx's logic did resemble some ideas that underlie marginal analysis. Anyway, the editor's note here is that William Petty, writes of more easy minds. Note 13, after teaching us about how erroneous definitions of money can be divided into 2 main groups, that is, those that treat it more as a commodity and those that treat it as less than one. The learned Professor Rocher, or Rocher, follows up with a hodgepodge catalog of writings about the essence of money. Here we don't even get the glimmer of an insight into the true history of the theory. Then comes the moral. For the rest, it is undeniable that the most later political economists don't maintain enough awareness of the peculiarities that make money different from other commodities. After all, it's either more or less than a commodity. So far, Ganel's semi-mercantilist reaction is not altogether without justification. And Wilhelm Rocher, anyway, more or less, not enough, so far, not entirely. What a way to define one's concepts. And Mr. Rocher, or Rocher, modestly anoints such eclectic professorial palaver, the anatomical physiological method of political economy, but he does deserve the credit for one discovery, namely that money is, quote unquote, a pleasant commodity. All right, that's the completion of Marx's own endnotes for Chapter 2 on exchange. Now, the editor's notes in lowercase Roman numerals, Chapter 2, the exchange process. We're looking at Karl Marx's Volume 1, Chapter 2, the Princeton edition of 2024. Number 1, with unwilling and used force, nicht willig and Gewalt brauchen in German, Marx is playing off a line from Goethe's famous Erlkönig poem written in 1782, Und bist du nicht willig, so brauch ich Gewalt. Number 2, editor's note 2, Levelers was a name given by their enemies to a radical populist group that, starting in the First English Civil War of 1642 to 66, advocated for power transfer to the House of Lords, universal male suffrage, and land use reform. With cynic, Marx is referring to the members of a Greek philosophical school. Cynic, in the modern sense of a depressingly negative or jaded person, was and is spelled in German Zyniker, whereas here Marx has Cyniker. The cynics of ancient Greece thought that the purpose of life and our greatest virtue is happiness. Achieving it required independence from and the negation of what the majority treated as the most important human institutions, that is, the family, the culture, the state, and so on, even if that meant causing social conflict. In comparison with Athenian society, the cynics lived like dogs, hence their pejorative name, cynikoi, or dogs. You just, live in those jars and wander around in the streets hoping that, social welfare will take care of you, whatever. Anyway, sorry for editorializing. Editor's note 3. La Mariton, a comical character in Cervantes' Don Quixote, appears in chapter 16 of the first volume, where Quixote and Sancho Panza, out on adventure, meet her in a roadside venta, an inn or tavern. Despite her bad breath, cheap costume, and coarse hair, Don Quixote imagines that he sees a beautiful princess. Editor's note 4. Equivalence is a pivotal concept for Marx's critique of political economy. Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations sees equivalent to as analogous with can be represented by. That is, what can be given in exchange for a quantity of a thing. Marx largely takes over this Smith's definition. Editor's note 5. An adapted line from Goethe's Faust, where in Act 1, Faust decides to rewrite the famous opening to the New Testament Gospel of John 1:1, which reads, "In the beginning was the Word." Faust generally settles on, "In the beginning was the act." Editor's note 6. These have one mind, and shall give them strength, their power and strength unto the beast. That's Revelation 17:13, the King James Version. And no man might buy or sell, save that he had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Revelation 13:17, King James Version. Editor's note 7. Marx's phrase an und für sich, in and for itself, derives from Hegel's version of the same. In itself, quote unquote, is the simplest and most unactualized. For itself has more complexity, but for Hegel, the most complex and self-knowing form is in and for itself. The phrase Ansicht, or in itself, became into standard philosophical usage as a translation of Aristotle's phrase kathoto, something that exists purely according to itself as an absolute without reference to other things. Kant used the phrase an sich to talk about a thing apart from any human cognition of it, a thing in itself that is not in any way for us, like a God, our approach to the sublime, blah, blah, blah. He famously banned knowledge of such completely disconnected things, leaving some of them to a different disposition, that is faith. It says all that, that's all that we're left with. For Hegel, a relational thinker, something merely in itself is impoverished. A thing is not much more if it is cut off from other things or from cognition. To Aristotle's in itself, Hegel adds two new philosophical modes of relationality. In itself, a thing is merely there. For itself, a thing, more like a subject, knows its qualities and can act on the knowledge. The agglomeration of both, that is, in and for itself, Hegel uses to talk about the highest form of being, when something becomes a concept. As a concept, a thing has recognized its place in a world of differences and has become explicit and legible to everyone. Following this meaning, Marx sometimes uses the phrase in and for itself to describe phenomena when they have developed to their most complete capitalistic form. Though sometimes he seems to use it just to mean things as they are, which ignores the philosophic meaning Hegel gave to it, and thus could be a lexical tick for Marx, or at times maybe a parody of Hegel. So that's kind of, you have to sort of get into what the context is. And of course, this has further meaning for the difference between concept and idea, or as Kant refers to it, theory and practice, et cetera, et cetera. Or, what Frege refers to this difference between concepts and ideas, which is then further applied to linguistic questions. Anyway. Editor's note 8. What Marx is calling the bourgeois revolution is commonly known as the French Revolution, 1789 to 99. Here he tacitly compares it with a future proletarian revolution, an uprising by workers. Marx recognizes the French Revolution as essentially an uprising of the budding capitalist class against the remaining feudal aristocracy. In the direct exchange of products, every commodity is for its owner a direct means of exchange, and is for its non-owners an equivalent, though only insofar as it is use value for them. Thus, the exchange article doesn't have a value form independent of its use value or the individual wants and needs of those engaged in exchange. The need for such a form arose only as the commodities entering the exchange process grew in number and kind. As this need emerged, so did the means for meeting it. When there are commercial transactions in which commodity owners exchange their own goods for assorted other goods and compare their goods with other goods, assorted owners, assorted commodities are always exchanged for and compared as values with one and the same third type of commodity. In becoming the equivalent for assorted other commodities, this third commodity attains directly, but within narrow limits, the general or social equivalent form. This general equivalent form comes and goes with the momentary social encounters that bring it into being. Fleetingly, it attaches now to one commodity, now to another. But as commodity exchange develops, the general equivalent form becomes firmly attached only to certain types of commodities, and thus it crystallizes into the money form. At first, chance only determines which type of commodity the money form attaches itself to. Nevertheless, generally speaking, two circumstances play a decisive role. The money form becomes attached either to the most important exchange articles from outside the community, which are in fact the spontaneously arising forms of appearance of local products' exchange value, or else to the main use object constituting the part of a community's property that can be disposed of, that is, heads of cattle, for example. Nomadic peoples were the first to develop the money form because all their possessions were in a portable form and could thus be directly disposed of, and also because their way of life constantly brought them into contact with foreign communities, thereby inviting exchange with the outside world. Human beings often made other human beings in the form of slaves into the original money material, but they couldn't have imagined doing that with land. Such a thought could occur only in an advanced bourgeois society. The idea dates to the last third of the 17th century, and people first attempted to act on it on a national scale only a century later during France's bourgeois revolution. You know, the concept of land reform clearly is part of that issue. So there we are. We are at the end of the editor's notes of chapter 2, volume 1 of the Princeton Marx translation by Paul Reeder and Paul North. It came out in September. It's still worth a read, however you want to deal with it. Let me, I put in the link to the chapter 1 that, and I'll continue to do this. I'll always have a reference to the prior chapter. And as we plow through this for the next X number of weeks, we can skip further and read faster, I suppose. I attached at the end, for those who really care about this, Ed George's notes, because I've used probably for every chapter of Capital, I've associated it with Ed George's interpretation, where he does the actual math, but also, you know, sort of explicates a certain set of relations, although he's not using the Princeton translation. And I hope that Ed will eventually go back in and see where there are differences. I don't think there are that many differences. So I do attach it also because, as I said, Ed does the math, which is the more current math. And so you can actually see, you know, partials and other kinds of things that are implied for those people who, you know, need to know that there is actually math underneath all of this, as it were. So let me just read the first paragraph to give you a flavor for what Ed George does in his notes on reading Marx. Chapter 2, the process of exchange. The purpose of chapter 2. What's the function of chapter 2? In chapter 1, we saw that A commodity is a use value or object of utility and a value. It appears as the twofold thing it really is, as soon as its value possesses its own particular form of manifestation, which is distinct from its natural form. This form of manifestation is exchange value, and the commodity never has this form when looked at in isolation, but only when it is in a value relation or exchange relation with a second commodity of a different kind. After having examined use value and then exchange value, we now need to examine the unity of the commodity as a whole. But to do this, we need to look beyond the individual commodity and see it in exchange. And so he, talked quotes from chapter 1, and there's all kinds of his own subheads: the contradiction, the realization. I've used up my time, so you might get further confused by what he's talking about. But Ed does do decent notation here, trying to talk about the overall structure where, you have two commodities and, sort of the third commodity, the commodity form that allows us, that third commodity that allows us to make these kinds of exchanges as we proceed further in the development, in human development, is money. And money is problematic for all the usual reasons that they still exist today. And of course, we have new varied analog and digital versions of quote unquote money that become incredibly problematic, and then we become obsessed with interest and blah, 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 blah. All of those things that are now modern elements of how we deal with money, even though they're not so modern when you think of the concept of usury. Anyway, so that's the crux of my yammering today. Romana saying domus, indeed. Actually, it would be Romanus Domus Aunt, I think. But anyway, as I become pedantic about this, needless to say, that's kind of what we looked at. If there are no interventions, questions, or brickbats for the live stream, I will ask Joe to. I will stop share and ask Joe to.
Well, Anne,
relieve us. Oh, James, yes.
I had a question. This is probably not the right time for it, but in this context of these readings, where do you think crypto fits in?
Oh, well, that's the interesting idea. Is I think it raises this useful question: is it an appropriate third commodity in this chapter 2 version? Because of the question of gold. I mean, you can always use that as a kind of measure of the argument. Can I use my crypto can I exchange my crypto for gold, which would be an interesting question and an interesting one in a much more a wider kind of context. Frankly, I'd love to see as I've said before, I think if there's got to be one Federal Reserve Bank that has a research division who somebody's trying to work through the digital commodity question or the digital currency question with some of this historical background. I would hope that someone is. I assume that someone is. It's not a job that I want to take on, but I assume that there's somebody in modern money theory who's really interested in this and who should sort of explicate this analog digital problem.
Yeah, because right now, gold exchanges like AppMex, they're happy to take crypto. They have slightly different rates posted for crypto, check, whatever. But yeah, they're definitely, you can buy gold with crypto at this point.
You can, but somebody's making money at the margin anyway. And someone always makes money at the margin. if you've ever sold gold, you know that people are making money at the margin. Which is sad, but if you get too, stuck in it, you turn into what, Midas, or it's a King Midas thing.
Thank you, Ann. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you for asking. I think that's useful in our context here.
You bet.
I think we have interesting histories of money that are being explicated. I mean, it's pretty clear that because he's an archaeologist, also, um, Michael Hudson is kind of does some work on that, and I think that's interesting in and of itself. And I hope that well, academically it's interesting, but I think ultimately we have to have that real kind of question, particularly since the Russians are running around all over the place trying to get gold, and you can see how brutally they've done that in was it Mali or wherever the hell it is, Burkina Faso, wherever the Russians have sent the dregs of their Wagner mercenary folks around, because they've been thieving gold, um, and quite brutally. I mean, they've been just going around ripping people off, which is essentially gangster sort of behavior. But then again, it is a Russian mercenary group after all. What do you expect? Anyway, so much for Mad Max sort of stuff that does go on. And I think people should acknowledge that as well. All right. So I think um,
And
yeah,
I have two questions, actually.
sure.
First one, that about page 3, there was a concept that I'd never heard and didn't quite understand. It's something about commodities have a need that's not satisfied until they double.
Oh, yeah.
What is it talking about?
I think he's talking about well, I'm not quite sure. I think he's referring to, no, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't want to speculate because I could be
Yeah, it was
Yeah, I know which reference you're making. I think what we're talking about in terms of doubling is what he refers to later on as what occurs in like when you're referring to value in a accounting period where it is how one calculates interest, right, at 100%. And when you talk about interest rates, you refer to it ultimately as a kind of doubling, but I'm not sure.
yeah, it was an odd sentence I never heard before.
I
Yeah.
recognize that. I think
Yeah.
they tried to retain whatever Marx meant by it and didn't further explain it, which is worth asking in whenever the two editors do a lecture. It's to say, what do you think that meant? Because I don't think they come back to it. Because doubling is not explained, I think, in the notes. It may be explained elsewhere. I just don't know.
And the other one is when Marx was writing about commodities
Yes.
like this, was the concept of fiat currency around?
Oh, yeah, sure. Fiat currency is the default, right?
Right, but it has no value.
No. Well,
So,
it can have value, I suppose, with all of its accoutrement. It just depends, there are contingencies on fiat currency. So the example that they use about the royal currency is that same example, right? Where you have an imperial declaration of what money is, yes? Of the value of money.
right. Well, yeah, if it's backed by gold or silver, but if it's not,
more by fiat, by
by just
imperial declaration.
decree. Okay, sure, I guess so.
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, the
Yeah.
point of modern money theory from a fiat point of view is to, say that fiscal policy rules, and that, you just sort of need to say, well, no debt. I mean, that's the kind of point of modern money theory, right? Is to say, well, I mean, we control the state, so therefore we can make this determination. Yeah.
Sure.
We can wipe out debts. The whole Jubilee question of that Hudson brings up, I think, is applies here. Do you understand? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, thanks. I just didn't know if in this exchange between commodities and gold, whether you never addressed the concept of fiat.
Oh, yeah. I think he mentions fiat later on in the discussions on money, but
Okay.
at the front end, he just wants to make sure that to tell
Just-
you that I'm still using gold, and there are various differences, but generally that's how he's going. He doesn't want to get into the whole thing about the difference between a fiat currency and something that is more contingent, right?
Right. So he's just simplifying the examples. So,
Yes,
okay.
that's this front loading of
Right.
the
Okay.
thing.
Thanks.
Yep. Anyone else? I mean, I actually thought it was good to include that, there can be an imperial declaration or the church's declaration on what things are worth. Similarly, it's the problem that, you worry about with usury. Where does usury take place? Well, it can take place in the Christian sense, in the temples, right? And, it can be problematic in that way. It's that whole rendering unto Caesar and rendering unto God thing. But anyway, anyone else? Okay, no interventions. Let me thank you. Thank you for your attention, and we'll continue on with this. Probably some return to just review. At some point, we're going to have to talk about Higginbottom's sort of overall view of capital, just to get a general version of it, because I still think that interpretation is better than, for example, the one that I just showed yesterday on a Soviet Stern's example, where he's doing essentially the orthodox interpretation, and you can see the difference, I hope, which I probably will make a comparison between the Soviet Stern version, which is as close to orthodox as you can get, and Higginbottom's sort of interpretation, which shows, oh, okay, there's all these relations, but then you have this other stuff going on that is not accounted for in kind of the orthodox or the tanky, as it were, view of Marx. And yes, I'm not being pejorative about tankies. They're there. They do stuff. They're annoying, uh, and they're quite ubiquitous. So whatever. And as I said, thank you for your attention.